Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
You survived it, Mike. You survived the big birthday weekend. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, and thank you for celebrating with me, Wendy. It really was fun to be around great friends and an awesome performance on Friday night.
Yes, that was so much fun. We had a great turnout, and everybody was really in the celebratory mood.
They were, and they loved making fun of me for being old, too. So it really stuck it to me nice and
It's what
nice
we
and
do,
hard.
though. It's what we do.
So, no, that was super fun. Enjoying Yahara Bay Distillery's fine different craft liqueurs.
Yeah, and their nice new location.
They made a Sunspot drink.
That's right.
The Sunspot Eclipse.
I had a couple of those, and they were delicious.
Yeah, I had a couple dozen of those, and they were great. It had Rocker vodka in it, so our friend Rocker makes his own vodka.
Mm-hmm. Also celebrating his birthday.
And he said he turned 40 for the 11th time.
Hey, all right.
But it has Rocker's vodka, and it had orange juice and a splash of what I thought was grenadine, but it was Crancello.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
that was really tasty.
It was, and Crancello is a different kind of liqueur they make at the place. So it really was, we were living with local music, local alcohol, local pizza,
Yes.
So it really was like a made in Madison kind of event.
And a special cake.
Oh, yeah.
Made by our friend with the Sunspot logo and everything.
Yeah.
So cool.
Thanks, Lisa, for making that awesome cake. So it really was a fun event. And then we tried to go to a haunted location afterwards, the Frequency, but they were closed.
No. Struck out on that one.
Yeah, but we
continued the party.
We still get the party at the Dice, and that's right. That is the most Madison of locations, so it's completely appropriate.
Yes,
And it was really nice. And in fact, in the interview today, Wendy, when Allison from Milwaukee Ghosts and I talked to Joshua Cutchin, he has gone to grad school in Madison, he got his undergrad in Madison from the music department.
Oh, just like us.
Yeah, right. But he was born in North Carolina, and then he came to Madison for college, and now he's back in the South in Georgia where he's working. But he was like, "Oh, a night out in Madison. I'm so jealous."
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Nice to know that people think fondly of going out in our city.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, and anybody who hasn't been here, when we go on tour and we talk to people, that's the one thing they remember. Like, oh, Madison, man, that's a fun town. So, the one thing they know is that we know how to party here. So I guess that's a friendly thing.
Yeah, they always remember that, and they always ask about smut and eggs.
Oh, yeah. To explain this restaurant to you, it's a restaurant that features, eggs, brunch. So you can go there Saturday or Sunday and have a nice brunch. But the TVs, instead of playing the Badgers game or instead of playing the football or whatever's going on, plays hardcore pornography.
So that's what people remember about our city. Isn't that great?
Yeah. So you can enjoy a little hardcore with your, hash browns. That's hardcore and hash browns.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be a good name. That's a good alternate name for it. Hardcore and hash browns. That's the vegan option. Anyway, so Smart and Party Madison. So it was. So anyway, let's introduce Josh Cutchin a little bit to you.
Yes,
he's interested in some of the parts of the paranormal that we don't always talk about. So when we think about hearing a ghost, you hear a moan or footsteps, or you see a figure or a shadow. You see a UFO. You see it in the sky. Maybe you hear a little beeps or boops or something like that. Okay, maybe you don't. Maybe the UFO is too far away. But when we think of the senses of a sighting, we think of hearing something, Bigfoot throwing a rock against a tree. You think of seeing a big ape-looking, sitting there.
Or a footprint.
Right. His books, The Trojan Feast and The Brimstone Deceit, talk about the taste and the smell of the paranormal.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I do recall other people that we've chatted with mentioning the smell thing on several instances.
And what's interesting is that how these different experiences people have often will have the same smell associated with it. So Bigfoot can have the same smell as a UFO.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and that's some of the stuff we talk about in the interview.
But what about taste?
Well, the taste is how food is often involved in paranormal experiences. We really get into fairies today.
Okay, excellent.
The Fae. And a lot of it talks about how a lot of people's experiences and legends that happen with the Fae. And you know fairies because we talk about Patrick Rothfuss in the interview, but you've read The Wise Man's Fear, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
And you've got
one of my favorites.
Right, but it's 100 too many pages where he's with the Queen of the Fae. hanging out there, learning how to be a lover. But,
Yes.
but a lot of people's experiences have to do with them trying to make you eat. Like eating with the Fae and the paranormal experience. So there's food associations with the paranormal and there's smell associations. It's funny is that I really originally was like thinking about the name of this, and should we just call it Joshua Cutchin and Paranormal Smells? Like I didn't know if we wanted that title because people would be like, paranormal smells disgusting. So we tried to make it a little less like, because when you think of a paranormal smell, well. Right.
Yeah, it's not pleasant, probably.
No. And you think of me on Saturday morning after the party.
Oh,
and
gosh.
it smelled paranormally bad. And or you think of Ludo from Labyrinth.
Right. The bog of eternal stench.
Smell bad. and that kind of thing. But Josh Cutchin is a fascinating guy, a UW alumni, and we're proud to have him. Let's talk to him. And this is an exciting moment for See You on the Other Side podcast because it's always a sincere pleasure to bring on another University of Wisconsin alumni.
Yay!
And number one, Allison from Milwaukee
everybody.
Ghosts, my lovely sister, is joining us today. And we are welcoming a fellow Fortean who's got 2 books out, The Trojan Feast and The Brimstone Deceit. We'd like to welcome Joshua Cutchin to See You on the Other Side. Hi, Josh.
Hi, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here. Like you said, with some fellow alumni from UW. That part of the country holds a special place in my heart.
And we're glad to have you. And so are you in Georgia right now, or are you in North Carolina?
I am in Roswell, Georgia.
Roswell, Georgia.
Yeah, there's a Roswell, Georgia. And I just so happened to wind up here. It was one of those things where I was like, of course, I'm here in Roswell, Georgia. Of course.
That's
the way these things work. Yep.
You know what's pretty funny about Roswell, Georgia, is for some reason, my IP address, I have a charter IP address from home. Mm-hmm. And so for some reason, the charter IP address always identifies as Roswell, Georgia.
Really?
Do you guys even have charter out there?
Yeah, we do actually.
Okay.
But that's interesting.
So it always says it's like your location. It'll give me like sometimes when Google will give you like local things.
Right.
It'll be like a pizza place in Roswell, Georgia, and I'm like, I don't think they'll get it there. There's no way they will get here in a half an hour or less.
Connection there we don't know about, Mike. Like I left my heart in Roswell, Georgia.
I left my flying saucer in Roswell, Georgia.
Well, I wouldn't you wouldn't believe it, but the Roswell High School marching band show this year was an alien abduction themed show. So
What?
Yeah. It was just like, of course, the year that I move out here, they do that.
That's fantastic.
Was it in honor of you?
No, not quite. It just happened. I mean, these sort of things end up happening if you spend enough time in this sort of field. And so I grabbed 2 T-shirts and I sent one to my good friend Greg Bishop and another one to my good friend Red Pill Junkie, as sort of a thank you and sort of a very unique gift from my area. So there's a Roswell High School marching band T-shirts floating around somewhere in Mexico City right now.
Oh, that's fun. Well, which instrument did they use for the anal probe?
Oh God!
Oh, Mike!
Come on, you know it was a flute.
The flute or an oboe. Yeah.
I hope it. I hope they didn't try. Well, you are a tubist as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So you are a Fortean author. So you work in music education too?
Yeah, so I take gigs and I play mostly jazz and rock tuba. So such things do exist. I just got invited to be part of a tuba quartet that's made up of 3 other freelancers in the area. But yeah, the lion's share of what I do is education based. So it's doing clinics at schools and it's teaching private lessons as well.
No, that's awesome. And Allison's in education. My wife was a music educator for a while, and the guitar player in our band is a fellow tubist and music educator from the UW Wisconsin. So it's part of the group here. That's great.
Yeah, it's one big happy family.
That's right. So, it's fun to talk about, when you think like, oh, yeah, we can have alien abduction, marching band stuff. And, I think about 25 years ago, there is no way we would have had an alien abduction marching band thing in my high school. And I wasn't in the marching band, so I can't tell you, but there was no way. It just would have been like, what? You guys are crazy. And almost this mainstreaming of the weird, and you have aliens and ghosts and the whole thing. So how did a guy like you get into Forteana and weird stuff in the first place?
Well, it's fascinating to me because I constantly hear about, these sort of subjects being downplayed, and, being sort of undervalued by a lot of people. And to me, I never put that together. Like it never really resonated with me in any way because my parents were always very open. I don't think they necessarily believed in any of these things, with a capital B, but they were open to it being interesting, So it was completely, acceptable for me to bring home books on all sorts of Forteana, especially cryptozoology. My dad was sort of a fan of cryptozoology, armchair fan of cryptozoology, as it were.
Nice.
So yeah, I've always had an interest in these things, and it wasn't until probably 4 years ago now, I really experienced a renaissance of these sort of interests of mine. Specifically, I had some time around. I was working at the University of Georgia, and around the holidays, I had a lot of free time. In terms of like my workload, it just dropped off dramatically. So to try to keep myself from going bonkers, I discovered the world of paranormal podcasting. Mysterious Universe was sort of my
very fun world.
Yeah, no, it's such a vibrant scene. I think that in terms of podcasts about subjects, the paranormal podcast scene is like one of the most robust and thriving sort of niches out there, and I think it's because it gives these fellow crazy outcasts that we that I consider friends. It gives us a really good way to connect. So I sort of discovered Mysterious Universe was my my gateway drug back into this entire subject, and from there it just kept on spiraling out of control. And I ended up getting the idea to actually become involved and permanently sully my name with being an author on these subjects.
You are now a professional crazy person.
Yeah, exactly. It's
like, I used to be an amateur, but now I got my own book.
Exactly. Well, when the going gets tough, the tough get woo, as I like to think about it.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I had gotten like a Barnes and Noble gift card, and I was like, I'm gonna get me a Bigfoot book. I haven't read a Bigfoot book in forever. And I picked up J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, which is a great book about Bigfoot sightings all along the Alaskan coast. And in it, Alley mentions that certain First Nations lore held that if you were to take food from the woodman, the Bookwus, in certain tribes, according to their mythology, that you would be trapped with them forever and stick with them forever. And that's one of those things where I've been so interested for so long in the Magonian aspect of alien abduction. I think that there is more truth in the idea that these phenomena are somehow related to the fairy folk legends of old. I think there's more truth to that than there is to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Yeah.
There's a word there I don't understand. Magonian.
Well, yeah. So for people that don't understand that, Josh, can you talk about Jack Valet and his connection and Passport to Magonia? I think that's where you're going with that, right?
Yeah, I would love to.
So Magonia is a place?
Well, Magonia was supposedly the realm in the sky from which wizards would launch basically dirigibles in medieval France. Certain times, whenever
like Hogwarts in space.
Yeah, basically. Hogwarts in the clouds. Cloud Hogwarts.
Okay, Hogwarts in the clouds because it was in France and had smelly cheese.
Yeah, so Jacques Vallée was one to point out that not only do these narratives of Magonia share a lot with what we would consider the modern day abduction scenario, but in his seminal work Passport to Magonia, he pointed out that there is a strong through line between fairy folk legends and modern alien abduction tales. If you look at, the list is pretty startling when you look at it on its face. I mean, you have strange light phenomena associated with both. You have the altering of time. People would go into fairyland and think they were there for 5 minutes and they were there for 5 years, or they would think they were there for 5 years and they were really there for 5 minutes. Well, we see this, reflected in modern abduction lore about, missing time that people have. Fairies would steal babies and replace them with changelings, just like, in the modern abduction motifs, you'll hear about missing fetuses and that sort of thing.
Yeah, phantom
Oh,
pregnancies.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The whole pregnancy where they're pregnant for a little while and then they're not, and the alien human hybrid babies who are going to be the gateway into how aliens get into our society. Because if they're half human, you can't hate them. You can hate an alien species, but if it's like, well, it's half human, then it's one of us, kind of.
Which I was just going to say, that's how we wind up with narratives that all the politicians are somehow reptilians, because then we can feel bad about thinking that they're subhuman. Yeah.
Right.
So and the list just continues on and on about these similarities between fairy tales, fairy stories, and alien stories.
Well, let's do a quick thing about some fairy stories, I think. Because a lot of people, when they think of fairies, they just think of like the tiny creatures, they might think of the brownies from the movie Willow.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or like, more of the Disney depiction of fairies as sweet little sprites.
Yeah, Tinkerbell stuff, yeah.
Right.
Tinkerbell shows up. But it all comes from, think of those pictures that the guy that wrote Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he was like,
the Cottingley fairies?
Yeah, the Cottingley photographs. Mm-hmm.
Right, so we always picture these little people wearing swimsuits and have wings and they little magic wand and bing, you're a real boy. So those kind of particular things. The fairies are a lot darker than that, aren't they?
Yes, and more intriguing, I think.
Yeah, the sort of gateway that I've found to help people get wrap their mind around it is, imagine ghosts that were never living people. And, these spirits being tied to certain landscape features in a very animistic sense.
So you're talking like elementals.
Yeah, earth elementals, basically, of some sort of variety. I am a Christian myself. The common Christian solution for writing off these earth elementals were that somehow they were, they were either the angels that got shut out of heaven, during the war in heaven, or they were the angels that were too good for hell and too bad for heaven, and then they fell to the ground, they fell to the earth, and that's how they got associated with certain locations. I don't necessarily feel, if there is an objective truth to this, I don't necessarily feel like that's happening. My personal cosmology is broad enough to encompass the notion that there might be entities in between. I'm always very critical of Christianity because they say the Lord works in mysterious ways, except for mysterious things which don't exist, and I always have a real problem with that.
So the idea of an elemental is that it's a personification, a nature spirit. It's a personification of the earth itself. But
Right.
the interesting thing about that is, how would a nature spirit manifest itself? Like when we think about what a person is. Well, part of what makes us human is the two eyes, the two arms, the ears, the hands, the feet, the physicality of us is part of what defines who we are. So what are some of the different forms that maybe fairies can take or nature spirits can take? Because if we think of like we are defined by that physicality, but we're also limited by our physicality. So what do we think the kind of forms that a nature spirit could take, a fae?
Well, if you look at sort of the existing literature, because basically what happened is you get into the Elizabethan era and the whole notion of fairy folk becomes completely co-opted to represent this sort of sweetness and light, basically Tinkerbell image that we have. Generally speaking,
Okay.
the fae folk were considered short. which is, an interesting parallel, again, to modern alien abduction, where you often have short entities. But having said that, they could really come in all shapes and sizes. You find certain Scandinavian tales of elf maidens who are human-sized and basically, indistinguishable from people. One of my favorite fae folk is the Celtic woodwose, who is a tall creature covered in hair, which sounds exactly like Sasquatch.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting.
Sounds like Bigfoot or a dude in a death metal band.
Yeah, exactly. Or my uncle. Right. So, and it's interesting because not only are there these fairy alien connections, but you got that woodwose thing. Well, if you look at like some of the behavior that people attribute to Sasquatch in North America, the gifting of certain foods, the braiding of horses' manes is something that some people claim Sasquatch does. These are all 100% down the pipe traditional fairy actions. So that's why I tend to I've been trying to adopt this term that I heard from one of my favorite thinkers on the subject, Gordon White, has been using this term Magonian to describe that sort of weird gray area where it doesn't feel like it's flesh and blood extraterrestrials or flesh and blood Bigfoot. There's something weirder going on, and I contend that there's something weirder going on in all these phenomena in general. But that sort of Magonian term is the broader term. I like it better than 14 because people say, "You mean 14?" And you're like, "No, I don't mean 14. I mean 14." so I've been sort of using I've been sort of using that Magonian term because also it's a nice signifier if someone recognizes the work of Jacques Vallée. I contend that all these subjects have similar, including ghosts. All of them, at the very least, are using similar methods to accomplish what they're accomplishing. They're all sort of touching on. They're all touching on a similar set of actions, a similar set of themes, and I think that we underestimate how much of a role we play in creating these experiences. Well, my good friend Greg Bishop has talked at length about the idea that we somehow engage in an act of co-creation. Not that these things are necessarily in our minds, but there is an objective intelligence that we don't know how to interpret, and we use what we bring to the dance, so to speak, to help us flesh out and to help us understand this very alien, in the traditional word, sense, this very alien interaction that we have.
Well, the commonalities between the fairy lore in Europe and the fairy lore in the U.S. among the native peoples is just startling. So, you're the way you went into talking about this has also intrigued me to see all these similarities between native lore and European lore. You got to wonder what's going on there.
Well, it's like that great quote from Goldfinger. Once is once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, and three times is enemy action. I mean, it really does push my personal threshold of credulity to assume that these are all. I mean, look, I think that there's something to be said for universal human archetypes. But some of the specifics are so specific, like this obsession with our reproduction, and the subject of a Trojan feast, this general food taboo that you will find in every culture across the globe. It's a little bit too startling to suggest to me that there isn't something very objective and very clear happening, within these stories as well.
So talk about that a little bit. The whole idea that if you interact with fairies and they offer you food and drink, don't take it. Can you give us a few stories? Can you give us a few stories that illustrate that, either from native lore or European or both?
And that's interesting. Real quick, I was going to jump in two things that relate to that exact question coming from the world of pop culture, where that's where I can bring my knowledge here. Number one, if you guys have read great Wisconsin author Patrick Rothfuss's series, the Kavotha Kingkiller Chronicles.
I am not familiar with that at all, but I've been in the market for a new. It's fiction? I'm taking. I've been in the market for some new fiction, so I would love to check into that.
Yeah, the first book of it, it really is something exceptional, and he's on the second book right now, The Wise Man's Fear, and the Name of the Wind is the original book, but he's a literature professor at UW Stevens Point, and it's just these books have taken off, and it's really fantastic fantasy. But in the second book, there's an entire what I feel like it's a way too long of a section, but there's 100 pages that he spends with the Queen of the Fairies. And part of it is you can't accept, those gifts and things like that. And the second example is from, I don't know if you guys watch The Walking Dead at all.
I did a long time ago when I sort of fell out. So
Sure.
I got my aversion to zombies, which you know well, Mike.
Understood. Yes.
Everything else paranormal, not zombies.
I've had to embrace my fear of zombies.
Yes.
And so I do. But
You've taken the other path. I understand.
There was two episodes ago of The Walking Dead. It was really funny because it was a character who had come to visit a new place called the Kingdom. And in this new place, they keep offering her like a pomegranate.
Oh, that's loaded with meaning. Loaded with meaning.
And eventually at the end, she eats the pomegranate. And that's the whole idea of, the daughter of Demeter, Persephone, right? She's trapped in the underworld. Right. And the only thing she eats are those 6 pomegranate seeds when she's there. And because of those 6 seeds, that's why we have winter.
Yeah, the 6 months.
Exactly. And then that's what anthropologists will cite as the reason that it's a universal myth, is because it came from this Greek myth of Demeter.
And I'm sitting there watching Walking Dead. I'm like, how many people are thinking about this gosh darn pomegranate, right?
And so what happened to her when she ate the pomegranate?
Well, we haven't gone back to that location yet, so I think
we don't know.
In a couple episodes, we'll find out.
We don't know how she's going to pay for it.
That's super fascinating. Well, yeah. So for me, like I've been interested, like I said, these fairy alien Bigfoot crossovers, and I knew that people during alien abductions had been offered food, but when I saw that Sasquatch thing in there as well, that the idea that if you accepted food from Bigfoot, you'd be trapped with Bigfoot forever. I'm like, okay, there's definitely a book in this. Should I go ahead and write it? And on completely on spec, I just started writing away, and it's really interesting because there is this commonly held belief that if you eat food with the other, you'll be taken and forced to stay with the other. Which again, like I mentioned, like you said with Demeter, supposedly this is all world beliefs are derived from that ancient Greek myth, which is fine. Like I'm a proponent of diffusionism. I think that it's almost an open and shut case that there was some sort of more advanced civilization on Earth at some point that had a much more global society than we think. But at the same time, like that's a really specific motif, and it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, maybe there's another answer that something objective is happening to these people. Maybe it really was a diffusion, but I don't think it's a diffusionism of the Demeter myth, because if you look at this particular food taboo, you'll find it in New Zealand, you'll find it in Europe, you'll find it in Mesopotamia, you'll find it obviously in Greece, as we mentioned, you'll find it in South America, you'll find it in North America. So it seems to be a very common, consistent folk belief held throughout literally the entire world.
Right, and it's so pervasive.
New Zealand's like the oldest civilization around, isn't it?
It's the Maori civilization is definitely one of the older ones. I think perhaps the Aborigines might go a little bit deeper.
Have a couple decades on them.
Yeah, yeah, just a couple. But yeah, it's interesting. I feel like people in the West don't really even think about Maori culture that much, but it's really vibrant and robust and insightful culture in and of itself.
Well, New Zealand's becoming more popular when they're shooting all the shows there, because they've got the Lord of the Rings, and they're even shooting Ash versus Evil Dead. The new Sam Raimi TV show is being shot in New Zealand with Lucy Lawless.
I didn't know that's where they were shooting it. That makes a lot of sense, though. Nice, yeah.
Well, so
I think that more people are going, more people are visiting there too and discovering more about that country.
Mm-hmm.
So, Josh, do you have some specific stories that you can share about fairy food, or other stories that maybe appeared in one culture and then you see another similarity in another culture?
Yeah, no, I'd love to rant about this for a while. So yeah, so you shouldn't accept food from the faithful is the idea, but at the same time, like to reject it is also a bad idea. I found some stories where people were approached by a banshee on an old dusty lane in the British Isles and were offered buttermilk and turned it down. Were actually blinded. So you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. The best method for avoiding this seems to be to employ deception deliberately. One of the more famous examples that you find of this is a story called Jimmy Doyle in the Fairy Palace, which was recorded in a book called Legendary Fictions of the Irish Celts, where there's this drunken guy stumbling home one night, and he sees a fairy castle on his way home, and he actually goes into the fairy castle, and there's this giant party, and they actually give him some food. And give him something to drink, and he actually, instead of drinking, he pours it between his waistcoat and his shirt, because he's told by someone he sees there, who is dead. There's this odd relationship between fairy folk and the dead, where they tend to be seen commingling at these gatherings. And he sees this person, and she says, "Whatever you do, don't drink, or you'll never return home again." And that's why he pours it,
Right, and that's asking a lot, because he's coming home on a night and he sees a party, he gets invited to the party, they give him some free booze, and he pours it in his waistcoat instead of drinking it. This Jimmy Doyle's really got his head on the right way.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, it's not fair. Like, I know if I'm 8 or 12 drinks in and I stumble onto another party, I'm gonna have trouble saying no to that.
Hey, sorry guys, but the zombie told me I couldn't finish his beer.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So that's one of the more popular stories that you'll see, and there are a lot of variations on this. Another one that's a favorite of mine is the fairy dwelling on Selina Moor. There was a gentleman who was on his way to a tavern one evening, and he actually found himself in a part of the countryside that I didn't realize. This is another Irish tale. And he stumbles upon basically this house where there are all these fae folk dancing around and having a party. And there's a taller woman who's supervising all the smaller fae folk, and she says, "Stay here, let me get you some ale." And as she goes away to fetch him some ale, this other woman comes up and grabs the gentleman and pulls him to the side, around the side of the house, and starts talking to him. And says, "Whatever you do, don't drink any of this ale that she's going to give you." Because I was at one point in this orchard that we're in right now, and I had taken a plum, and I'd eaten the plum, and that's why I've stayed here. And at this point, the gentleman realizes that this was a woman that he had once loved, that he had assumed had died. She actually she never came back from this, and the fairies had given them a changeling, a shell, that they actually ended up burying. And she said, "Whatever you do, don't eat any of their food. Their food is not real. It's nothing but detritus." She says they're not even Christians. They're star worshippers. Whatever you do, don't ever eat their food. So what he does is
they're star worshippers.
Oh yeah. Oh no. We're gonna unpack that here in a moment.
Please.
It was
drop that bomb.
Yeah. No. It's great. So there's a fairy. There's a method supposedly at that time in Ireland that you'll hear about sometimes, is that by inverting some of your clothing, you're sort of turning the world upside down, and so that will actually break a fairy spell. So he actually takes his gloves off and turns them inside out, and the next thing he knows, he wakes up inside of a barn. So it didn't work to save his long-lost love. But the motifs in that resonate so strongly with modern abduction lore. The first thing is that you have this taller supervising entity that is sort of governing the actions of these smaller entities. You find this in alien abduction accounts all the time, where there are shorter gray aliens that are supervised by a taller gray alien. So that's the first thing. You have this food component, which still does occur in a lot of abduction stories, which we can get into later. You have this star worshiper, this star worshiper thought bomb, which is like a great revelation. But what's interesting to me too, and I actually didn't mention this in the book, but I thought of it later, is the act of inverting clothing to escape the realm of the other, you find in modern abduction accounts too, right? Because you'll find people who claim to be abductees who will wake up and say, "My pajamas were on inside out." And, if we assume like an extraterrestrial hypothesis, a very nuts and bolts thing, we're like, "Oh, well, the aliens must have put their clothing on wrong side out." But it's interesting,
right? Because they're not going
to
check for the tag.
The tag, yeah, exactly. But it's interesting to me that still resonates with this older lore in terms of, the experience ends and their clothes are inside out. So I think that that's one of the more powerful stories and really illustrating these connections that we've talked about. In terms of the role of food and drink in modern alien lore, you can pretty much divide it up into two main categories in into two main categories in the literature. So you've got the contactees, which we normally associate with the 50s. We normally associate with more human-like entities. In those experiences, it's always voluntary. It's always very pleasant food that people are given, and it's always consumed, like I said, voluntary, pleasant, and it's just generally a very positive experience. Just like the contactee experience is usually voluntary and pleasant. A lot of these space brothers had certain messages about peace. In the more modern era, you see the abduction experience take over, and the motifs of that. The abduction experience in and of itself is involuntary and it's forced. It's under duress. And similarly, the food profile matches up with that as well, because these foods are usually consumed under duress or force-fed, and they're usually unpleasant, and they're usually just a generally nasty experience all around. It's interesting that a lot of times in modern abduction accounts, you find liquids being administered. In my own survey, which is the first survey of its type done on this, I found that by at least a 60% majority of the cases included drink instead of food and drink. It was mostly a liquid of some sort that was given to the experiencer.
What was your methodology when you did a survey like trying to find out the food and drink involved in alien abduction reports?
Well, yeah, no, it's a huge data set to wrap your arms around, and there's so much in little corners of the literature where this sort of thing is mentioned. The best place, the lion's share of my research began, this wasn't the be-all and end-all, but it began with Albert Rosales' Humanoid Index, which at that point was still online. Albert has compiled a list of cases, mostly from the 20th century, but stretching back all the way into the 1700s, of tens of thousands of cases. The high-profile cases that you hear about, the low-profile cases, he's got pretty much everything in there. Unfortunately, he's taken them offline and has actually begun publishing them. Good for him. Do what you need to, Albert. But in terms of a loss for the community, it's a big loss in terms of just having that sort of as a resource for us all. But that was a good place to start. So basically, what happens if you're listening, Albert, I'm just being completely honest here. You find these accounts in his index, and they're not always sourced impeccably. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging on your own, because I'm not about to cite just that as a source. I mean, I do every now and then, but I'd like to go back to the original source of where he found it. So some of it's from the research files of certain investigators, and in that case, that's where I do cite those directly from Albert's compilation. But if I can, I always traced it back to its source, being it in a MUFON journal publication or in an actual book itself. And so if it's the closest thing that we as a community have to a humanoid database that is literally like the be-all end-all. And there's some stuff. There's quite a bit of stuff in both my books that aren't part of Albert's part of Albert's collection as well. So, but that sort of was the meat and potatoes of the methodology for going through this.
Cool. Well, I'm gonna have to check out that index.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And Joshua, what drew you to look at such specific details? I mean, could you talk a little bit about what that might reveal? So looking at small details maybe could reveal something much greater than we've seen. Well, it's just to me. I have a good deal of friends in the ufological community, and but at the same time, I'm very critical of a lot of the things that you read and see, because in this mad rush to prove that aliens are visiting us from Zeta Reticuli or Zebel Ganubi or whatever, we've sort of tried to take shortcuts, and time and again they have, resulted in us getting slapped on the wrist and our, going home with our tail between our legs, to mix metaphors. We haven't really taken the time to look at these from the simplest components and then sort of build out from there. We want to jump right to solving the big questions. Are there aliens visiting us? Is there a giant, tall, hairy hominid running around North America? And I would contend that those particular avenues of research are not as rewarding as really dialing it back and taking a look at the basic stuff. My latest book is Brimstone Deceit, which is looking at the smells that people see in these encounters. I am at least a little bit ashamed
that it's taken until 2016 to have this book written. Like, it seems like that'll be one of the first things that you do. Like, what can we learn from these small details? So the phrase that I often like to employ is that we're not seeing the trees for the forest. We're trying to see the big picture, and we're not taking a look at the little things, because in these little things we might actually gain extra insight. I realize right now that what I'm saying probably sounds like I'm being high and mighty. I mean, like, you know, this is, again, like, they're better. I almost wanted to write about these subjects just to create a dialogue in the community about, you know, seriously taking a look at this. Like, let's include, for example, smell in all of our, you know, citing databases and all of our interview questionnaires. You know, let's really look at the fact of whether or not somebody was given food or drink in these sort of, you know, liminal experiences. Let's really take the time to investigate every avenue before we try to solve these larger questions, because these smaller details might lead us to a solution for the larger questions in a more in an easier and more relaxed way, if you will.
Well, and we explore the world through our five senses. It just makes sense that we should use all of them.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I had played around a little bit. Some people have been talking. They're like, "Is Josh going to do a like a smell, like a sense trilogy or something?" Because I've done taste basically, and I've done smell. But I don't really want to write a Trojan touch. That sounds a little bit sketchy. No, I don't know. I don't know how much.
It could be a big seller, Josh.
I know, right?
But I'm like interested in, you know, because I love a Trojan feast, and then, you know, this newest book is just fascinating to me because the sense of smell is really important and is often overlooked, I think. Oh yeah, we take a lot of this stuff for granted. You know, I think that's. Both A Trojan Feast and The Brimstone Deceit are full-length books on something that might have gotten a chapter in another book. And I think that has become... I mean, like, for example, with smell, which is what the Brimstone Deceit is all about, it really is... We have a complicated relationship with smell. While a lot of philosophers have held that it's sort of a base animalistic sense, at the same time, we in an individual basis really put a lot of weight on it because it does seem to suggest some sort of objective reality. I mean, you know, if I see a hologram of a plate of lasagna projected onto my table, like, I'm not going to believe it unless I can smell it. You know, I'm not going to believe it unless I can get that, you know, wonderful smell. It's the same reason that people don't like having artificial Christmas trees. I mean, you know, they're always wanting to capture that smell so it feels, you know, it feels real. So you think like smell confers, you know, some type of authenticity? It does. And what's interesting is that if there is any sort of control exercised by the entities in these encounters, which I think we have to a certain degree assume that it does because of the way that they're able to evade, you know, hard evidence being captured of their existence, whether it be Sasquatch or ghosts or aliens or something. They seem to be in control of the situation. If they are in control of the situation to the extent that they can actually control what they smell like, they make poor choices in terms of not wanting to be noticed, because a lot of the things that these entities smell like we are very sensitive to as a species. One of the more common smells that you run into is hydrogen sulfide. It's one of those. So the book is called The Brimstone Deceit. I've gone back and forth about it because it sounds a lot like a sort of a Christian apologetics book or something. I am a Christian. This is just me piecing together these pieces. Sorry, go ahead. Well, maybe there's some influence there of Christianity on our perceptions of these phenomena. Yeah, that really is part of the question. Like, I suspect that. Well, this is sort of a deeper topic for us to get into, but I suspect that...
That's all right, man. Let's go deep.
I suspect that the smell of sulfur in a lot of these encounters is sort of like a self-reinforcing meme, if you were. I'm not sure that it means that aliens are demonic. I think that it has led to aliens being interpreted as being demonic, or, Bigfoot being interpreted as being demonic. I was on Coast to Coast 2 weeks ago. I was watching the chat room, and somebody said, "This guy is right, because these are all fallen angels, they're demons, and they all smell like sulfur." And I'm like, that's not at all what I said. I literally never said anything like that. I went out of my way to say otherwise. But you do run into this smell of sulfur with these entities, and it's funny because sulfur in its pure form actually does not smell. So people are usually smelling some sort of sulfur compound, usually sulfur dioxide or hydrogen sulfide. Getting back to the idea of these entities being in control of the way that they smell, if they are, they've made a very poor choice, because we are sensitive to sulfur compounds to an extreme degree. If you take a look at hydrogen sulfide, which is that rotten egg odor, it occurs wherever organic material decomposes in the absence of oxygen. So rotten eggs, swamps, septic tanks, that sort of smell.
My bedroom,
my gut. People joke about methane, but methane is actually non-odoriferous. It's one of the primary odoriferous component. I mean, there are many, but the primary odoriferous component in flatus, to be polite, is hydrogen sulfide, and we are sensitive to hydrogen sulfide to the point of 0.5 parts per billion. Now, to put that in perspective, if you've ever seen these big semi trucks that have a big tank on the back hauling milk or water or whatever, if you were to take an ink dropper and drop one drop of ink into that solution, that would be twice the concentration at which we can smell hydrogen sulfide. It's a mind-bogglingly. Our sensitive to it is mind-boggling.
Why are we so sensitive to it, though?
I mean, why?
Is it because, so we don't eat so many beans, or what?
Well, if there isn't a universally reviled smell, if there is, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur would sort of be the closest thing that we have, because it is a primary compound that's released during decomposition. It's not the only one. There are cadaverine and putrescine, but a lot of the decomposition smells that we associate are sulfur compounds. So there's a hedonic association between that smell and just being unclean. So, it's, again, we tend to de-emphasize the importance of smell in our lives, but without smell, you'd probably eat that turkey leg that's been sitting in the fridge for too long or something, So it really is, it ties into it being a warning mechanism, really.
It lets us know that we're about to eat something or to not ingest something potentially harmful to our bodies.
Yes. Because as mammals, we tend to prefer to be in environments that are not hazardous to our health. And being amongst filth, being amongst decomposition and decay, is generally speaking hazardous to mammalian health.
Unless we're looking for mushrooms like Allison loves.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. So I love mushrooms. I have a love affair with wild mushrooms that started this year that everybody knows about because I post about them endlessly on my Facebook. But I was really, really intrigued when in the Brimstone Deceit you started talking about the Fae, because let me just admit it, I'm a big fan of the Fae, but the whole idea that they might smell like mushrooms really struck me.
Yeah, so you find these connective motifs, and it's really interesting. I don't know, Allison, have you listened to a lot of Terence McKenna's lectures?
Well, I am familiar with Terence McKenna and just psychedelica in general.
Yeah, speaking about a guy that loves mushrooms, that's Terence McKenna.
Yeah, definitely. So I was actually thinking about this the other day. Like, I would encourage anybody who's interested in these subjects and the way that they interface with perception and whatnot to, like, go. All his lectures are online. Go listen to them, because the guy was a very unique thinker and had some very, very cool ideas. I mean, he cited the fact that if you're looking for extraterrestrial life, maybe we should start with looking at the mushroom, which seems to have, psilocybin mushrooms seem to have some sort of intelligence behind them after they're consumed. I don't know if that's user error or what, but there seems to be, and not only that, but like mushrooms can survive in the vacuum of space. There's not a more innocuous, helpful organism on the planet Earth than the mushroom, which is literally like springs out of decay.
Yeah, so you're talking about like the whole like concept of the plant teachers, right? That there's some kind of consciousness in these plants or in mushrooms specifically.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I haven't tried psychedelics myself for a lot of reasons. One of them is that
You have a job.
I have a job.
That's a big one.
And you want to keep the job?
Yeah, and one of them is that they are illegal, and I'm kind of a goody two shoes for the most part. And another aspect to that is the fact that I'm not entirely sure how well the experience would be for me from a health perspective. I have some health considerations that I'm sort of wary of.
Or what about the whole set and setting? I mean, what if you're not ready for it?
Right.
These things can be powerful, life-changing in positive, but also in negative ways.
Right.
Exactly.
Nobody's judging you for not taking mushrooms. We're not we're the opposite of the DARE program. Dare to do drugs.
But I talk about it so much that I feel like some people out there on the internet, because people on the internet are critical in general, they've probably been some very critical things about me said. But I do think that there is something objectively intriguing about the idea that there are plant teachers, the idea that certain spirits behind certain plant teachers get on a tear. I mean, if you want to look at, I've talked with, again, to drop his name, Gordon White, about this sometimes, is the idea that, like, Mother Ayahuasca is on a tear throughout civilization. Like, she is on a mission, because you look at the way that ayahuasca is being treated nowadays. It's kind of like people, you go to the West Coast and people on the street know what ayahuasca is. That's weird.
It's been mainstreamed.
It's so weird. You don't find it, in Middle America, and you don't really find it on the East Coast that much. But like, it's a thing. Like, I hear,
we're in Middle America, and some of us still are.
Well, yeah, fair enough. But like, you don't like but like I've listened to non-paranormal podcasts where they mention ayahuasca, and it's like that's strange. I don't think these people are necessarily using it in the right context, but at the same time, like, it seems like there's some sort of driving force behind certain entheogens, certain ritualized plant teachers, as you mentioned, that seem to have something of a mission. And I would argue that it's the whole altered states of consciousness thing. Like, I think that we ignore the role that altered states of consciousness play in these Magonian experiences at our own peril, because there are a lot of similarities. A lot of the logic of these experiences tends to follow out that sort of the same narratives that you would experience under the effect of certain drugs. That doesn't mean that it's not real. Some people, this knee-jerk reaction.
Remember the X-Files episode where they're both trapped in like that cave with the fungus?
Oh, the ancient fungus?
Yeah, from the dark recesses of my brain, that rings a bell.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they're both trapped, and they go through this entire fantasy of the thing that of an adventure that had happened to them when they're really trapped inside this fungus the entire time.
Right. Yeah. And there's another modern pop culture reference from 2015. Joshua, did you see the movie The Hallow?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just getting back to the fairy mushroom connection, which is very evident in that movie, which I thought was pretty good.
The Hallow is a great movie. Those fairies that come after him, that ain't Tinkerbell, baby. They're really.
That's right.
They're nasty. They're nasty. Yeah, I like that movie. I would really love to see somebody do one of my favorite current depictions of fairy folk is in the Netflix series, or I think it's an Amazon series that came to Netflix, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Oh yes, I that was from the BBC. Yeah.
Yeah, that actually touches on some stuff that you don't see depicted in fairy folklore a lot. They basically he has these parties with the dead every night as a fairy, which is something that you never ever see in fairy folklore. So in that sense, it has a certain authenticity to it. But yeah, it's really interesting to me that you have these certain. So for me personally, I have come to the conclusion that the transceiver model of consciousness is probably the right theory that we should be pursuing.
Okay, unpack that a little bit. What do you mean about?
I'd be glad to.
Yes, please do.
So a lot of modern materialist science would have you believe that mind equals brain, so that like if your consciousness who you guys are, is an epiphenomena of brain activity. Epiphenomena refers to something that is more along the lines of like, sand dunes aren't formed to be sand dunes. They arise out of wind patterns in sand, and they form in certain manners. So you are
personality is like a side effect of our brain doing work.
But if you have followed any sort of psi research in the past, let's be conservative and say the past 15 years, it becomes very apparent that psi phenomena is real. Such things as telepathy and precognition do exist in some sort of level. Some of us might be better at than others, but this is one of those things that I will entertain people who are skeptical of UFOs and Bigfoot and fairy folk and all these things all day. I get very weary very quick of people who say that there is nothing to psi phenomena, because there are peer-reviewed articles that talk about these things in a very natural way. In addition to the fact that we have this stuff happen in our lives all the time, So
yeah, and we just kind of blow them off. Is what I think.
We do. No, totally. I agree with you. Yeah.
So many things that happen, synchronicities and psychic connections, and I think in our modern society, we are told to just brush those things away, and I think of it as I'm very skeptical, or I have been in the past, and I saw that just kind of like taking over my experience when it didn't necessarily always even fit, and so now I see it differently. I'm seeing it as this materialist approach as just one very narrow way of looking at the world, and that there's many other ways that other cultures have brought to us. So when I think of my experience now, I'm trying to focus on what I call a decolonization of belief. The idea that you don't have to be ruled, by that dominant paradigm.
Nice.
But you can look at both sides, and then sometimes you see something else, and it surprises you. Like, let me just tell one quick thing.
Sure.
All right.
Because it's related to our mushroom conversation. So,
man.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but okay. So I've always been interested in this idea of foraging, but I've always been leery of foraging for mushrooms until this year. And then so I started to reach out and find out there were ways to get these wild mushrooms, legal wild mushrooms, let me just say. And so I started exploring that. And in my life, where I work at a school, and so where I travel every day from the building to the parking lot to get to my car, I had just learned about a certain mushroom called a giant puffball, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it is giant and a big white thing.
Blow your mind, man.
If it's touch, it releases spores in sort of a puff. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. No? But it's a really big one, like soccer ball
God,
size.
That sounds terrifying. Releases spores. That's like the beginning of a Michael Crichton novel.
Well, you got to get it before the spores come out. But anyway, then you can eat it. It's really good, actually. But anyway, so I had just learned, I knew about little puffballs. Every kid knows about little puffballs because you shove them in somebody's face, right? And you blow all the spores all over them. We did that, right, Mike?
Yeah, you did to me.
Yeah. And so, yes, because... I'm the big sister. I did bad things. Let me just say that. But anyway, so on the way to the parking lot one day, I see a white thing just off the kindergarten playground, and I'm like, could that actually be a puffball mushroom? Because I had just really learned about them the week before, and I was like, what is this really? And so I went over, and at that time it was softball sized, and it was indeed a giant puffball mushroom. And then we were able to watch it, and it grew to humongous size. And so I've been working at the same location for 10 years. I've never seen anything like that. And okay, I didn't know about giant puffballs, but I got to tell you, if there was a giant puffball growing somewhere, I would have been like, hey, what is that? And checked it out. So to me, it's just this coincidence that, I'm really into mushrooms this year. And everybody who knows me will verify that. Mm. And then I get what seems like a message to me growing, right where I walk by every day. And so I work at an intertribal school, and I was talking to my Oneida teacher because it seemed like a message, and I didn't quite get what the message was at first. And then I started to describe to her what mushrooms do. And how, they're an integral part of the forest, and they really help support the life of the forest, and how they grow underneath the ground, and there's like mycelium like everywhere, like miles and miles of it, but you never see it until all of a sudden it bursts forth, and you, for a brief moment, you see a manifestation of it. And so as I was describing it to her, I got the message that it was trying to confer. I talked about my skeptical nature, and how I'm always looking for a message, that this is real, that there's some objective reality to Forteana and, spirit specifically. And then as I was describing this to the Oneida teacher, I got the message that spirituality is like this mycelium growing underneath everything, supporting everything. And you only very rarely see it burst forth, but it's always there and it's pervasive.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. It's almost, that's an argument for these fungi to almost have some sort of governing role in reality, which is sort of a far out idea. But if you look at the way that certain substances like that do interface with our consciousness, it seems like less of a crazy idea. I mean, like I consider myself a skeptic too, for the most part. I like a lot of this. Like if you start talking to me about reptoid conspiracies, my eyes glaze the hell over. I don't care. But if you start to, once you start to realize that perhaps our brain isn't something that generates consciousness as a byproduct, perhaps it is something that's more akin to a television set, where it can tune into certain channels and it can actually have a non-local consciousness can actually manifest itself through our brain. It makes a lot more sense of things like altered states of consciousness. It makes a lot more sense of how perhaps there are certain phenomena that interact with that model and are able to present themselves in ways that they wish to appear.
That transceiver model, if you read A Brief History of Consciousness by Gary Lackman, it really goes into like how the idea that we think of that everything comes from our own brain,
Right.
But then there's these situations of people who lack those parts of the brain that you need to have personality, to have consciousness, and there's no brain there, and they still have it.
Yeah, there are these stories that are not apocryphal that are actually, pretty well documented of people who have literally 10% of the brain mass that everybody else does, and that they still have what appear to be, that's not discovered until they go in for something completely unrelated. They actually, they have a fully functioning personality, they have a fully functioning, life. And interestingly enough, I mean, like, you, on the other hand, you find people who, what I love about the particular metaphor, that particular way of seeing the way that we live in our day-to-day world is that it explains so much. I mean, if something happens to the brain, if I put a golf club through my TV screen, it doesn't mean that the signal is gone. It just means that the TV is now incapable of rendering that, or can only render it in a significantly diminished capacity.
And it also means that you watch the last episode of Lost if you put your golf club.
Oh man, I was so close to doing that. Oh, it was so frustrating.
Don't go there.
But I have to commend both of you because like acquaintance of mine, Mike Clellan, once said that if you are talking about aliens or something and you don't get into the big questions after a certain amount of time, you're kind of probably talking to the wrong people. And like here we are, like we're so far afield from what we originally started talking about. I think that's a great endorsement of the way that you guys think. No, this is exactly what I would have been disappointed if this hadn't happened. So this is exactly the sort of you're good people.
Smells bad. Oh wait, is there consciousness? Like
no, it's. These are the right conversations to be having. So, and I think that's where we're all going at,
Well, talk a little bit about, because we're back to talking about the brain now. So So maybe you could talk about the relationship with the sense of smell to the brain, and why that's so important. And we talked about maybe alarms, but is there any different way that the brain perceives smells as opposed to other senses?
Well, it's fascinating because we still don't quite understand how smell works. There's certain things that you find out that science isn't completely as doesn't have locked down as much as they'd like you to think they do. Like sleep is another one of those things. We don't entirely understand the mechanisms for sleep. I just saw an article talking about how we don't quite even understand water, certain things about water. And smell is definitely one of those things. Nobody has a really good idea of exactly how smell works. The most common and most popular idea is that there's sort of a key lock configuration where certain scent molecules, you can conceptualize that as a key, are compatible with certain cells in our nose, which you can conceptualize as locks, and that sort of stimulation is relayed to the olfactory bulb, which then fires some electrical impulses at the amygdala, which is responsible for a lot of emotions.
Real quick, is this an urban legend, like the idea that you can only detect 20 kind of smells, or like how many smells your nose can detect? Like, because I feel like I can detect like flatulence, something dying, and old lady perfume are the only 3 smells that I even know exist.
No, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest an idea like that. I mean, there's definitely. So it's difficult because smell often works in conjunction with other senses. Smell, the way that we interpret a smell is quite often influenced by other sensory information. So if we my favorite example is that if I hold up a piece of Parmesan cheese under your nose and tell you I just, barfed into a bucket, you're probably going to recoil. And if I tell you I'm making, Italian food, you're probably going to smile. So there is a lot to suggest that it works best in tandem with other senses. What is definitely certain is that the amygdala, is very much tied into emotion and memory and all these sort of involuntary actions. And because of that, smell is very much linked into how we remember things. So to the extent that certain people who are having experiencing Alzheimer's actually have noticed a diminished sense of smell. Anyone who's ever had a lover and has smelled their perfume on someone else will realize that regardless of how good that relationship was or not, they will remember that person without even being able to to force that sort of emotion off. So it becomes apparent that this is a sense that is ripe for manipulation. I mean, I can't imagine being an entity that has the sort of control over experiences that these phenomena appear to be able to, and having access to this very intimate, very easily manipulated sense that we have as humans. So that's sort of where a lot of this grew out of, is like how much perhaps we are being deliberately deceived, to bring in the title of the book, or perhaps we're being deliberately manipulated by these phenomena via our smell. I think that's a question that definitely deserves some extra investigation.
So where does the idea of the Brimstone Deceit, like, what are we being tricked about when it comes to the smell of sulfur and rotten eggs?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily being tricked as much as it is being manipulated. If you look at the way that these phenomena tend to intersect, they seem to be using, if we're not looking at the same thing, we're looking at different things with similar methods, at the very least. So it seems to suggest that perhaps these scents are being used, if not to communicate something to us on a subconscious level, perhaps these particular scents are being used to deliberately influence how we act, or, as I sort of go into later in the book, being used to place us into a certain space in which these things can interact with us. So hydrogen sulfide, which is the most common. So, okay, let me back this up a little bit. If people say that they smell sulfur, generally speaking, they're smelling hydrogen sulfide. They might smell sulfur dioxide, which is that gunpowder fireworks smell, but
Gunpowder don't make you barf.
yeah. In my experience, people generally are conflating sulfur with hydrogen sulfide. And it's interesting because hydrogen sulfide is highly toxic. There have been, for example, I believe it was the late 90s or early 2000s, there was a series of suicides in Japan where people were creating hydrogen sulfide out of existing cleaning products, and they were puffing it and dying. But at the same time, technically any gas that isn't oxygen, if you breathe enough of it, it's going to be toxic because you're not getting enough oxygen. But it's a very dangerous compound. But interestingly enough, in the past 6 years, it's been revealed that hydrogen sulfide, when used in proper amounts and administered carefully, can actually induce suspended animation in mammals. Again, this idea ties into the possibility that perhaps we need to be in an altered state of consciousness to interact with these intelligences. The suspended animation thing is interesting to me because so many times in paranormal encounters, people talk about being frozen to the spot, or, the alien waved a wand and I was paralyzed, or I couldn't move because I was staring at the Bigfoot, or the ghost froze me in my tracks. All these things tend to suggest these different things. And if you look at the way perhaps that we co-create and the context in which our environment perhaps plays in these events, perhaps, if you encounter this intelligence, whatever it is, in a deserted forest, you're going to interpret, or you're going to be helped along the road to interpreting it as Bigfoot. If you see something strange in the skies, you might be helped along the way to interpreting that as a UFO.
And sometimes the physical aspect of the smell is how we
you verify it. Yeah,
it's how we get there.
It's how you get there. Yeah.
Right. So
we might need to have that smell in our faces, like, oh God.
Right, because the molecules are actually getting in us when we're smelling something.
Yeah, it's an invasion in a lot of ways. And
so it can act like it's like an antenna booster.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it too. And so the book is called The Brimstone Deceit. It actually talks about like a lot of other smells too, because sulfur compounds represent only a plurality in my experience of these of supernatural encounters, meaning the largest portion but not a majority, if that makes any sense.
Oh, no, it totally makes sense after an Indian buffet.
So it's really interesting to me that a lot of the other smells that you encounter that aren't hydrogen sulfide are what are referred to as trigeminal stimulants, which are smells that actually activate a response system or a nerve system in the face, and actually will bring us, smelling salts are a good example, will actually bring us out of a state of diminished consciousness. So it seems like you see these two different smells on a spectrum, on a continuum.
If you can get out of a stupor with smells, can you be put into a stupor with smells?
Right. I mean, is it like a doorway?
Yeah, I mean, I would contend that that's a possibility. I mean, again, my model and my theorizing, it suggests that you would need some sort of highly refined control system to administer these sort of smells and complete control. But I mean, is there anything for us to believe that isn't the case in a lot of these experiences? I mean, again, the fact that we don't have more concrete proof, I do think we have photographic proof in some sense of a lot of these phenomena, but the fact that it isn't more concrete suggests that they are in complete control of these experiences. So perhaps they can shift us in and out of certain states of consciousness that allow us to interface with them. Sort of like the set and setting thing, right? You know, there has to be the stage has to be set for us to have these experiences, and then we can interact. And it's what I like about it too is that you sometimes run into multiple witness sightings of certain phenomena that actually have conflicting witness reports. You know, two people will say I saw this, two other people will say I didn't see it, and perhaps, you know, biology, personal individualized biology is the reason for some of those events happening.
Right, because if it doesn't exist on the physical plane, if it just exists on the like the mental plane, and it is a transceiver, then what happens is that some people reacted, the transceiver was able to pick it up, and some people weren't, and their transceiver wasn't able to pick it up. You know, what you just said, Josh, made me think about my wife used to work at a cat care clinic in the west side of Madison, right? And so one thing she learned about the cat care clinic was she's like, oh man, even the cats, if they're the worst, you just grab them by the back of the neck. You grab them by the back of the neck and lift it up a little bit, and all of a sudden they get calm.
Yeah, they have that switch.
Right, they have that switch when you grab them.
What might our switches be?
Yeah, imagine being positioned so.
Our switch.
Yeah, even if you because I think it's probably pretty obvious to anybody listening at this point, but like I'm not a big extraterrestrial hypothesis guy, but even if you ascribe to that. An intelligence that is sitting so far above us would probably know that, and would probably be able to take advantage of that. I think that it's a consideration that deserves more attention than we've given it.
And the funny thing is that nobody's talked about smells. And the first book we have on the Brimstone Deceit, we're already going to how we're being manipulated by the aliens got us by the bad smells, man.
Well,
go ahead, Allison. Sorry.
Yeah. So all this is reminding me of something that I read recently regarding this idea called the pheromone theory, and it's really a hypothesis. But so I'm reading this book, "The Ghost That Haunted Itself," the story of the Mackenzie poltergeist by Jan Andrew Henderson, and in there, he posits this idea that perhaps, you know, what's happening with the Mackenzie poltergeist, which is a very active phenomena where people are going into Greyfriars Cemetery, and they're in the Black Mausoleum, and then something reaches out and strikes them or scratches them or causes them to faint. And there's lots of stories.
I was touched there.
You were?
Yeah.
Okay, tell Mike. Tell about your experience.
No, we went to the Greyfriars Cemetery, and we sat and I was in the far back. I was the farthest back you could be, and I thought Chris tapped me on the shoulder. My wife. I thought that she tapped me on the shoulder, and then I'm like, nope. Chris was like a foot away, like her arm couldn't even reach over there.
So you actually had an experience there. You actually felt something.
Yeah, but you know, when it comes to like touch experiences, I never get too excited about it because it's like, oh, it could have been just my head or whatever. But I felt something, turned around. I thought it was Chris putting her arm around me.
It comes back to what we were talking about, you know, writing stuff off again, right?
Right. I totally wrote it off. I'm just like,
don't just brush it off. You know, maybe something really did happen there.
Yeah, but I was Mackenzied by the poltergeist.
Well, I heard that's what he likes to do. All right. So anyway, the idea is that maybe what's happening here in, you know, all these experiences with the poltergeist is the same as what's happening in like, you know, mass hysteria situations where something is triggering our alarm system, and it's some kind of pheromone release is what the pheromone theory posits that is causing the group to experience something, and that would be, you know, explain too why, you know, some people react more strongly than others, but you know, also the groupthink aspect of it where it's like contagious.
Well, here's yeah, I mean those are all excellent points. I mean, I have a problem with this idea, not with what you said, but with this idea that materialist science has, that something can be in your mind and not be real. Like, I have a problem with that. You know, my love for my wife is in my mind. I can't quantify it in any sort of objective way, but it's completely real. And I know it's real, and you can't tell me otherwise because you're full of... Can I curse? You're full of something.
Full of something.
So, yeah, full of something. So yeah, and I find that really quite problematic in terms of the way that we have managed to paint ourselves into this sort of materialist corner.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Paint ourselves to a materialist corner.
But maybe, like some kind of pheromone release is really proof that, something out there is manipulating our sense of smell.
No, I think that you reminded me of this too. I think that smells are actually, even in and of themselves, a potent metaphor for the paranormal in general. I mean, it's like the fourth time I mentioned it, but again, chaos magician Gordon White mentioned we live in a magical world. Not all of us necessarily, interface with it. It's sort of like being a dentist. We all have teeth. We're not all dentists. So whether you like it or not, this is sort of the world that we are enmeshed in. And it seems to me that smell might be a very, very poignant metaphor for how we... For the paranormal. It's constantly around us. Sometimes we notice it, sometimes we don't, but it's always influencing us. Sometimes it influences us more strongly than others, but it's this unseen thing that is constantly around us that we are interfacing with it, whether we like it or not.
And I think that's a great way to end the conversation today, in that we are interfacing with this world, the weird world, the interesting world, the far more interesting world, I think, whether we like it or not. And so, Josh, if people would like to pick up copies of your sweet books, where can they find them?
Well, both are available. Both The Trojan Feast and The Brimstone Deceit are available from Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com in a variety of formats, including a bunch of popular e-reader formats, including Kindle. And some e-reader formats I've never even heard of, so maybe that's for you as well. My personal website is joshuacutchin.com. I try to put up a blog every couple months. It's not a blog post every couple months. Short form fiction is not necessarily my strong suit, but you can find links to all my interviews and appearances there, a great many of which are part of the podcast that I'm part of called Where Did the Road Go, which you can also hear that podcast. I'm on there probably every other week at wheredidtheroadgo.com, a roundtable with myself, Soraya Azkath, Red Pill Junkie, and Michael M. Hughes.
And this is fascinating. I mean, I really, really could talk to you all day.
Well,
there's so many questions I still have. I can't believe we have to be done.
Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to invite Josh again on in a couple of months, so we're going to do another one.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah, anytime. Seriously, you guys don't have a guest. Just check in with me and see if we can make it happen. Because and I wouldn't say that for everybody, because there are some people that I talk to and we don't ask the right questions. But like, we went so far afield in a good way. This is you are good people, so I would be happy to appear again.
Thanks,
would love
Josh.
to talk to you guys again.
Thank you so much.
Make sure you guys go check out Josh's books, because I've read them and they're really good and there's a lot of information and it's stuff you have not thought about. So if you're looking at a new way to look at the paranormal and Forteana, then Joshua Cutchin's stuff is going to be right up your alley. Now, Allison, if people are interested in finding your research, where can they find you?
You can find me at milwaukeeghosts.com.
Fantastic. And all of this stuff is going to be available at the show notes at othersidepodcast.com/119. Thank you, guys. So Josh was a lot of fun to talk to. And Allison was so excited to have this conversation with him. She texted me beforehand. She's like, I got 1 million questions for him. So can we get through all the questions? I'm like, if we don't get through all the questions, we're going to have him on again. It's no problem.
That's great. Love the enthusiasm, Allison.
Yeah, I really do. And, we talked a lot about the Fae and the fairies. And we also talked about being old a little bit at the beginning of the podcast. And so we thought for a perfect one is let's play the first song we ever wrote as the band Sunspot.
Oh, yes.
So we originally wrote this song in 1996.
Whoa.
And inspired by the dark nature of fairies, here is Sunspot with Morgan Le Fay.
Around me, I'm
for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Ooh, it's Thanksgiving week.
It is Thanksgiving week, and we need to give thanks.
We do. So let's thank our wonderful Patreon community.
You guys, you
for all your
patrons.
support.
Oh, the best. Oh my God, you're so good.
Seriously.
And if the rest
Really help us out.
the rest of you would like to get in on some of that Patreon action, the place to go to is othersidepodcast.com/donate. And then you can join, and we'll be thanking you every week in addition
That's
to our
right.
AWESOME Patreons.
And a special shout out to Ned.
Ned, who was at the party on Friday and also had his birthday
Yep.
in November. So happy birthday,
Yes,
Ned.
thank you, Ned. Happy birthday. And everybody have a great Thanksgiving. We love you all. And we will see you next week.
Stuffing turkeys. I don't know why I said I was going to say it's like turkey stuffings. I said stuffing turkeys instead. I don't know if I'm going to keep that.